Robert Maxwell woke up from his own scream. His heart was pounding against his ribs as if trying to break free from his chest. The same nightmare. Again. In the dim light of the single candle he allowed himself to light, Robert wiped cold sweat from his forehead. The black silhouette of Whiskers appeared by the bed, silent as a ghost. The cat stretched its neck, examining its owner with amber eyes that glowed in the darkness like two small lanterns. "It's all right, buddy. It's all right," whispered Robert, though they both knew it was a lie. Nothing had been all right, not for a long time. Robert's house in Pine Creek had long ceased to be just a dwelling. Now it was a fortress, the last line of defense between him and what lurked outside. He lowered his feet from the bed and touched the cold floor. In his nightmare, he again saw Mrs. Jenkins from the neighboring house going outside at night, drawn by something invisible. He heard her scream, which suddenly cut off. The next morning, the Jenkins house was empty. Robert approached the small calendar on the wall and crossed out another day. He kept track of time, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps to not lose the last remnants of normalcy. "Shall we have breakfast?" he said to Whiskers, who was now sitting on the windowsill of the window covered with a metal plate. The cat responded with a quiet purring. Robert often wondered if Whiskers understood that the world had changed, that it wasn't safe outside anymore, that their little dwelling was an island in a sea of uncertainty. Robert opened a can of tuna, one of the few that remained. Whiskers got half. Robert made do with the rest and some crackers, washing it down with water. The food would last about a year if he was very economical. And then, Robert didn't want to think about then. After breakfast, it was time for the weekly inventory. Robert went down to the basement, the only room he considered truly safe. Here, in the darkness dispersed by the weak light of a kerosene lamp, rows of shelves with provisions were located. Canned goods, dry foods, rainwater collection tanks, medications, everything neatly labeled, everything numbered. He remembered how it all started. At first, the news was just strange. Isolated reports of people not returning home at night. Then there were reports about the night seekers. People who saw them described them differently, but everyone agreed on one thing. They emanated horror, something inhuman. The government issued a recommendation to stay indoors after sunset. Then the recommendation became an order. Cities began to empty. Television broadcasted only government messages until it shut down completely. The internet lasted a bit longer, but it disappeared too. Phones stopped working. The last person Robert saw was Martha with her children and husband. They were packing their minivan, their faces tense with fear. "Come with us," she begged. "To my sister's in Montana. It's safer there, away from the cities." But Robert refused. He believed that his home, his preparations would protect him better than fleeing. Perhaps that was a mistake, but now it's too late to think about it. That was almost 3 years ago. Having finished the inventory, Robert went back upstairs. The day seemed endless. He tried reading by the light of the kerosene lamp, but the letters blurred before his eyes. Usually, he spent most of his time in semi-darkness conserving light. Sometimes he exercised, push-ups, squats, stretches, anything that could be done in a limited space. Occasionally, he checked the protective structures on the windows. Most often, he just sat motionless, listening to sounds from outside and trying to catch ordinary sounds of nature, imagining the outside world. Robert also kept a journal where he recorded his observations, thoughts, and fears. It helped him maintain his sanity. From loneliness, he talked to Whiskers, telling stories from life before, as if retelling some ancient fairy tale. Dinner was a ritual that Robert followed religiously. He would set the table, light candles. Whiskers took his place on a high chair, specially adapted for him, and received his portion of dinner, which he consumed with pleasure next to his owner. It was a moment of normalcy amidst the madness that had engulfed the world. "How's dinner, Whiskers?" asked Robert, watching as the cat neatly licked his bowl. "Not the best, of course, but better days ahead, right?" The cat looked at him as if understanding the futility of this lie. As the sun began to set, Robert knew this only by his watch. Since he hadn't seen the sky for many months, preparations for the night began. Every lock, every bolt was checked. The basement door was closed, the escape route ready. Robert and Whiskers headed to the inner room. Once it was the second bedroom, now their bunker. They sat in darkness, waiting. And then they came. At first, the sounds were distant, rustling in the forest 100 yards from the house. Then closer, scratching near the fence, whispers that didn't sound human. And finally, right by the house, scratching on the walls, knocking on doors and windows. Sometimes Robert thought he heard his name, spoken by voices that had no right to know who he was. Whiskers pressed against his chest. Robert stroked him, feeling his own heart racing with fear. "We're safe," he whispered again and again. "They can't get in. We're safe." And yet every night, lying in darkness and listening to these sounds, Robert asked himself, how much longer? How many nights until they find a way to get in? How long until his fortress falls? And what awaits him then, when the last candle goes out and night envelops him completely? Whiskers began refusing food on Tuesday. At first, Robert didn't pay much attention to it. The cat was sometimes picky. But when he didn't eat dinner or the next breakfast, anxiety began to gnaw at Robert's soul like a rat on a wall. "What's wrong, buddy?" he whispered, bringing the bowl of canned tuna right to the cat's nose. "This is your favorite." Whiskers just blinked his amber eyes and turned his head away. Deep in the storage cabinet, Robert found an old veterinary manual. His fingers trembled, turning the pages under the weak light of the kerosene lamp. Whiskers' symptoms, which Robert was able to identify from the manual, corresponded to dozens of different diseases. "We'll make it through," he whispered, stroking the cat's head. "We survived the end of the world, damn it. We'll get through this too." By the 5th day, Whiskers could no longer get up. He lay in his basket, his breathing shallow and uneven. Robert sat beside him, forgetting about his security rituals, about checking the supplies. He held the small body of his friend, feeling each rib under his fingers. "You have to pull through, buddy," he whispered into the fur that once was glossy black but now seemed dull, as if covered with dust. "We're strong together, aren't we?" The next night, Robert couldn't sleep. He watched as Whiskers breathed more and more slowly, how his small body occasionally trembled. Sometimes he reached out his hand toward the cat, but didn't dare to touch him, as if even the lightest touch could cause suffering. Whiskers died quietly on Sunday. Robert was just telling him about a summer at Lake Michigan, about his mother and father who were laughing, sitting on the pier. He didn't immediately notice that the small body in the basket in his hands had gone still. "Whiskers," he whispered, touching the cold head. "Whiskers." Something broke in Robert's soul. Something that had kept him afloat all these years. In a moment, Robert broke down sobbing, allowing himself genuine, unmasked emotions for the first time in many months. His shoulders shook with heavy, hoarse sobs that escaped from his chest as if from the depths of a well. He cried until his tears dried up, leaving behind only emptiness and a dull pain. Once, Robert thought, the world was filled with sounds, people talking, music, the noise of cars. Now the silence that reigned around seemed deafening, unbearable. In this emptiness, his heart felt only one thing: absolute, all-encompassing loneliness. He buried the cat in the basement, under the cement floor. He dug a hole with old tools. He placed the small, wrapped body in the earth and talked about the years they'd lived together, about losses, and about how Whiskers was the best, most faithful friend he could have ever had. When the last piece of broken concrete was placed on the improvised grave, Robert sat down beside it and leaned his back against the wall. In the basement silence, his voice sounded hoarse and broken. He took out a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, a photograph of Whiskers taken before everything began. In it, the cat was sitting on the windowsill, basking in sunlight that gleamed on his glossy black fur. "I'm sorry," Robert said quietly, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry that your last days were spent in darkness, that you could no longer warm yourself in the sun or chase insects. Forgive me for not being able to save you." He placed the photograph on the fresh earth and slowly stood up, his knees creaking from the strain. Taking one last look at the burial place of his only friend, he whispered, "I hope there, where you are now, there is sun, and it shines brighter than ever before." After the funeral, Robert stopped being afraid, or stopped caring. He no longer followed his security rituals, didn't check supplies, forgot to eat, to drink. He sat in the chair by the sealed window and stared at the wall for hours, sometimes forgetting even to blink. Time now flowed strangely for him. Sometimes he realized that he had been sitting like this for several days in a row and couldn't remember if he had gotten up at all. The only evidence that he was still alive was the pulsating pain in his temples and the unbearable thirst that periodically pulled him out of this half-alive state. Then the voices came. He thought it was a trick of his tired, exhausted mind. Whispers that penetrated through the walls so distinctly that he could make out individual words. "Robert, come out. We know you're in there." He began tapping a rhythm with his fingers on the wooden armrest to drown out these voices, voices that couldn't be real. Not during the day. The night seekers only came after sunset. Everyone knew that. But the voices wouldn't retreat. Sometimes they were interrupted by indignant whispering, as if the seekers were arguing among themselves. On one of those days, tapping his frantic rhythm on the armrest, Robert noticed a thin gap between the metal plates covering what was once a panoramic window. A beam of sunlight, thin as a hair, penetrated inside, drawing a bright line on the floor. Robert got down on his knees and put his eye to the gap. The light burned like fire after many months of darkness, and he recoiled, but then approached again. Beyond the window was his backyard. Green. Alive. A breeze ran through the grass, creating waves like on the surface of a lake. Robert could see part of the forest visible in the distance. And no seekers. None at all. "It's a trap," he whispered, but couldn't tear himself away from the gap. Hours passed as he sat watching the ray of light slowly moving across the floor, remembering his mother, who cried at his college graduation, his sister, who called every Saturday, his father, who died alone in a nursing home because Robert was too busy with his career. And again, the voices, but this time closer, almost under the window. "Robert, it's Martha. I know you're in there. Please answer." Robert froze, feeling his heart pounding. Martha, his neighbor, the one who moved to Montana 3 years ago. "He's not responding," he heard another voice, deeper. "Maybe he's—" "No," Martha interrupted. "I saw a light last night. He's in there. I'm sure of it." Robert pressed his forehead against the cold metal plate, closing his eyes. His brain refused to accept reality. This must be some new trick of the Seekers, a new form of torture. "You know what they do," he whispered to himself. "They imitate the voices of those you knew. They lure you out." But a part of his soul, the one that remained rational, couldn't help but ask, what if everything he believed throughout these years was a lie? What if they really were his neighbors, his friends? What if they had returned? He opened his eyes and looked through the crack again. And this time he saw a silhouette, a woman's, at the edge of his yard, too far to make out her face, but something in her posture was so familiar. Martha? Could it be possible? Robert's eyes narrowed in disbelief as he pressed against the crack, trying to get a better look at the female figure. The silhouette slowly raised a hand in a gesture of greeting, so human, so normal, and Robert's heart clenched with painful hope. For several seconds, Robert stood motionless, staring through the crack. "There's someone there, Whiskers," Robert said, and a moment later he remembered that the cat was gone. This thought hit him like an electric shock. After 3 weeks of apathy, grief suddenly exploded within him with renewed force, but instead of further sinking into darkness, it gave birth to a strange decision. "To hell with all this," he muttered. Robert began removing the metal plate from the living room window that faced the western side. His fingers, once dexterous, now trembled clumsily, and his nails broke against the metal edges. Blood mixed with rust, but the pain seemed distant, almost like a foreign sensation. Hours passed. Sweat ran down his back, his shirt sticking to his body. But despite the exhaustion, Robert felt a strange elation, almost euphoria. With each bolt unscrewed, with each section of metal removed, he felt himself coming back to life. Finally, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the plate fell to the floor with a loud clang. The window, a real glass window, opened before him for the first time in years. Light. God, so much light. Robert instinctively raised his hand, shielding his eyes that had grown accustomed to darkness. But gradually his vision adjusted. And then he saw the sky, an ordinary sky, boundless, with light clouds and deep blue that was slowly coloring into golden red tones of sunset. Red golden light poured through the window, filling the room. Dust danced in the rays like in a slow-motion film. Robert stood motionless, captivated by this simple beauty, and felt a smile appearing on his face, the first genuine smile in many months. "Look, Whiskers," whispered Robert, turning to the empty room. "Look at the sun. Just like in the old days, remember?" Only silence answered him. A bitter lump caught in his throat as reality struck him again. His little furry friend was no longer by his side. No one would rub against his legs, purring with contentment. No one would jump onto the windowsill to watch the sunset together. "I think you would have liked this," Robert said more quietly, wiping away an unbidden tear with the back of his hand. As twilight fell, Robert began to notice movement beyond his yard. At first, just vague outlines between the trees. Then, more distinct figures. The night seekers were coming out of the forest, surrounding his house. In the last ray of sunlight, Robert finally saw them clearly, and this image shocked him to his core. They looked like humans, like ordinary, living people. Among them, he recognized neighbor Martha and old Mr. Peabody from the grocery store downtown. But something was wrong. Their eyes seemed empty, without a single spark of consciousness. Their movements were too mechanical, as if someone was pulling the strings, an invisible puppeteer. They moved in synchrony, like a single organism. "Oh God," whispered Robert, backing away from the window. "These monsters, all of them were human." With each second, the darkness thickened. Robert knew he should run to his shelter in the basement, close all the hatches, barricade himself. But he remained standing in front of the window, watching as the last rays of the sun disappeared below the horizon. The moment the last ray disappeared, the figures began to move faster, purposefully approaching the house. There were dozens of them. They appeared from all sides. Their movements became more coordinated, smoother, faster. Robert didn't move. Something inside him had made peace with the inevitable. The doors and windows of the house began to crack under the pressure of dozens of hands. Robert stood motionless in the center of his living room, still gazing at the western horizon where the last reflections of day were fading. Glass shattered, doors ripped from their hinges. Robert closed his eyes, feeling cold hands touching his shoulders, neck, face, dozens of hands pulling him into the darkness. 1 year later, Emily Carpenter turned the key in the lock, closing the door of her house. The sun was almost down, and she was in a hurry. Everyone knew not to stay outside after twilight. Leaning against the window, she watched the shadows lengthening across her yard, and then she noticed a figure at the edge of the forest. So they had found her too. Now it was only a matter of time, how soon they would try to break into her home. A tall man stood there, motionless like a statue. His face, as far as she could make out from such a distance, seemed expressionless, empty. When it became completely dark, the figure slowly turned and disappeared among the trees. But Emily knew he would return tomorrow, and the day after, and every day, waiting for the sun to set again. Perhaps he was once known as Robert Maxwell, but now he had become just one of the night seekers, doomed to wander eternally in darkness, with the last ray of sunset forever burning out in their empty eyes.